Chapter 3, Lessons in Responsibility. The Mini had been my first taste of freedom, but Mum's old Golf felt like progress. Painted a bold yellow with black and white checked seats, it seemed like a grown-up car. It had a bit of presence. I added a cheap stereo and swapped the lights into double headlight GTI lookalikes. Convinced it looked the part, even if it only had a 1.1 litre engine. It was a 1.1N. The Golf replaced the Mini on the long drive to Liverpool, and it soon taught me lessons that had little to do with driving. Lessons about weight, responsibility, and control. One journey with my friend Graham, who I've known since I was 2 years old, stays in sharp memory. The car was heavy. I'd picked him up from university and was taking him home, and it was full of his gear and Graham and me. But I drove as though it was empty, without the experience to understand how much weight affected a car of that size. Anyway, I went for an overtake, misjudged it badly, and forced an oncoming driver to brake hard as we scraped into the gap. I glanced sideways as we did so to see Graham's silver cross clasped between his teeth. His face was drained of colour. I laughed nervously at the time, but inside I knew I'd been reckless. The moment burned in a truth. Weight changes the performance in cars and in life. Ignore it and you risk disaster. The Golf also mirrored my attitude to rules. My cars were always insured and mechanically sound, but the small disc in the windscreen, road tax, rarely took priority over petrol money and lights out. Lights out. Lights out. One afternoon in King's Lynn, I spotted my friend Carl, who was a police constable at the time. He was parked up on a roundabout as you enter Lynn in a Rover SD1 jam sandwich. I saw him, went right round the roundabout and swung round and pulled in behind him. Carl was sat with his sergeant beside him. He quickly got out, walked over to me and told me in no uncertain terms, and these were not the words that he used, to go away. He pointed out they were there to spot tax dodgers, and I hadn't even bothered to put an expired tax disc in the window. Whoops-a-daisy. And my disregard for rules was obvious to everyone. Years later, many years later, when Carl at that point had risen to chief inspector, he invited me out in his unmarked car. I spent half the drive flicking the hidden lights and the sirens like an excitable schoolboy still. I was probably in my late 30s or early 40s. Mischief still lingered, but so did the lesson. Authority mattered, and rules, however small they seemed, had a weight of their own. The Golf's life with me ended abruptly. I came home in 1982 to find it gone. I was home on leave, excited to get back to my car. And Mum explained to me that Julia, my sister, had borrowed it and written it off. I was expected to be grateful that she was unhurt. I wasn't. The car had been mine, a symbol of independence, and once again I felt the loss and the sense of control slipping away. But by then, my real lessons were happening at sea. On my third trip, I was posted as senior midshipman, aboard the Laertes, with 3 first trip middies under my care. At 17, I was still half boy, half man, proud of my uniform, yet still moody, teenager-like, and reluctant when faced with real responsibility. Each morning, the chief officer handed me down the daily work list. At first, I moaned and muttered like many teenagers. The tasks always felt endless and the authority overbearing. And so he treated me as what I was presenting, another lad who needed prodding along. And then came a turning point. I realized I could either resist, dragging myself unwillingly through each day, or I could lean in. Instead of waiting for orders, I started suggesting the day's plan. Sir, would it be sensible to tackle this today, or to do this, or why don't we do that, and then we can do that? To my surprise, he listened. Our work lists grew shorter, and the tone of his voice changed. Where once had been dismissal, slowly there became respect. It was my first taste of leadership, not through command or volume, but through attitude. I began to see how life responds differently when you bring energy rather than reluctance, can do instead of can't do. My small team worked harder when I carried myself with confidence. And I discovered the strange truth that responsibility, when embraced, felt lighter than when resisted. That revelation never left me. Like the sea, life will not bend easily. But sometimes, if you shift your stance, the whole current changes in your favour. This lesson was tested when we anchored off Port Harcourt, Nigeria. The coast at that time, maybe it still is, but then was notorious for pirate attacks. Just weeks earlier, 7 German sailors had been murdered. And the week before, a Russian ship had fought back with AK-47s, killing a number of the pirates. And then they went out to the 12-mile limit, dumped the bodies, came back in. However, we had no guns. I organised my middies onto patrols. We rigged high-pressure hoses along the deck, fashioned shields out of plywood, even filled bottles with sand and paint stripper. And a few, quietly, without the captain knowing, with petrol, with cotton waste to light. We were more excited than afraid. Our bravado masked the danger. At 2, I think it was the second morning at anchor, the war canoes came. War canoes got about 8 people in. The alarm sounded as I called up to the bridge to the second mate who was on watch, and the captain wisely ordered us to bolt down all the watertight doors and lash them. And the pirates were really after the cargo, not the humans. But adrenaline has its own momentum. And as we went up deck by deck, securing the ship, The crew poured out from the lower decks with axes and with sticks with nails in that they'd made, screaming and yelling into the night. The pirates scrambled back to their boats, never imagining we were in fact unarmed against their rifles. Realizing we were missing the action, I hurled an out-of-date smoke float onto a canoe that was nearby. Orange smoke poured out. Convinced it was a grenade, the men leapt into the sea. I stood roaring with laughter. Looking back, it's hard to believe, even as I read it. We had sticks, they had machine guns, and our survival was not courage, it was luck. My final voyage as a midshipman before my exams was on the Cyclops, a very large crude carrier, a VLCC. She was vast, more like a floating city than a ship. And strange to me, my first tanker. Pipes, valves and gauges covered every bulkhead. At first I was overwhelmed, but watch by watch I found my footing. I was made into the acting third mate, and I loved it. By Ecuador, I was standing my own deck watch, trusted with responsibilities far beyond my years. And I felt proud. And then the sea reminded me how fragile even giants can be. During loading, the gauges on number 1 tank didn't seem to be reading correctly in the control room. I asked Helen, the third mate, the first female officer I'd served with, she was the real third mate, not the acting third mate, to go forward and check them on deck. You wind them up and down and make sure they're not sticking. It was normal, and periodically that's exactly what you did. And as she arrived at the bow, she wound the gauges. No, they're okay. And then she walked to the side of the ship and she called out on the walkie-talkie in horror, "The sea is black." Unbeknown to us, the tank had rusted through. Thousands of tons of crude oil had poured straight into the ocean. I was sick with guilt, convinced I'd caused it, but later learned the truth. The steel itself was flawed, Russian-built, weak, and riddled with weakness. The incident left me shaken. Sometimes I realize failure isn't born from your own mistakes, but from the foundations you trust crumbling beneath you. After discharging in Texas, we anchored off Aruba for repairs. From the outside, it sounded like paradise, beautiful island in the Caribbean. In reality, we spent weeks climbing down little ladders into cathedral-sized tanks. We had 21 of them. They really were as big as a cathedral, and you climbed down this little ladder, slippery with old crude oil. In the dark, just a torch. And when you got to the bottom, you had a bucket of paraffin and cotton waste, and you wiped up crude oil. And you kept doing that until this giant space was clean, and you kept going. And it was like an oven in the Caribbean heat. We worked 12 hours a day, lungs heavy with the fumes, bodies black with oil. And as we came up for lunch, instead of going to the saloon, because it was just so much to try to clean down, we sat on the bar stools, which were covered in a bin bag, in our boiler suit, and just had something to eat, back into the tank. It was brutal and filthy work. But responsibility meant carrying on as a team, getting the job done, even if it was miserable. Eventually, the Cyclops was ordered home by the company. She was to be laid up in Falmouth, near the King Harry Ferry. She was to be sold. Dispersed. The company had 70 ships when I joined, and by the time I left as a midshipman 4 years later, they had 7. It was a difficult time. I left older, tougher, and with a clearer sense of responsibility. Ships, like people, may look vast and indestructible, but without integrity, they collapse. And as I stepped ashore from those early voyages, I began to see how each chapter of my young life was shaping me. A yellow Golf that taught me about weight, a friend in uniform who reminded me of the rules, nights in West Africa that revealed the thin line between bravado and danger, life and death, and giant ships that showed strength can still crack. Responsibility was no longer just a word that adults used. It was real. It was mine, and I would follow it into every corner of my life. Life lessons from chapter 3. Weight matters. In the Gulf, I learned that extra load changes performance. And that's true in life. The more you carry, the more carefully you must steer. Respect rules, even small ones. Dodging road tax seemed trivial until I saw Carl enforcing it with his sergeant by his side. Authority and structure exist for a reason. Disregard them too lightly and they can catch you out. Attitude, this was the biggest one for me, transforms not just responsibility, but life as a whole. And on the Laertes, I discovered that moaning, complaining made life heavier, made every day drag, while initiative, taking hold of what was there, made the days fly by. They became fun, and I became respected. Bravado isn't bravery. Laughing at pirates was youthful foolishness, not courage. Real bravery lies not in noise, but in wisdom, patience, and restraint. Respect earns respect. Helen showed me that gender, as with race, is irrelevant at sea. Ability and attitude are the only things that really count. Seeing people clearly for who they are is the foundation of leadership. Even giants can fail. The Cyclops leaked oil not because of us, not because of me, but because her very steel was flawed. Strength without integrity, in ships, in business, in life, doesn't work. Please listen out for chapter 4. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.